Hi everyone, my name is Paul Makin and I'm from the Moduloop Foundation, and I've been working with Lewis Daly and Justus Ortlepp on merchant scheme extensions for Moduloop and support for QR and USSD payments within that merchant scheme. The object today is to give you a report on where we've got to so far, and also to give a demonstration. So the framing of this work is essentially learnings from a national deployment, where we've looked at merchant payments in a couple of national deployments, in fact, and done some diving down into the requirements and really started to understand what is necessary, and also building up from Justus's work in fraud and money laundering, etc. Sorry, anti-fraud and anti-money laundering. Sorry, Justus. And using that to drive some of the underpinnings of this. So we're focused on interoperable merchant payments, taking the view that limiting it to a particular DFSP is not helpful. So we're focused on customer-initiated payments. So that means that's where a customer uses their smartphone to read a static QR or can use USSD to initiate a payment. Merchant initiated and fintech app initiated are further down the roadmap. We took the view that we should start on the more straightforward use case first. But an important principle is that the merchant receives the payment instantly and releases the goods. It must be interoperable, as I've already said, across all connected DFSPs. So what we've been doing is to do the design work around merchant payments infrastructure, and the framework we're trying to build is a modular extension around a Moduloop hub. So this is something that any Moduloop deployment could deploy to add merchant payments or a merchant payment scheme around an already deployed hub. It uses a merchant registry and merchant IDs to support fraud and money laundering detection. It's also independent of the front-end tech. A lot of the work that we've been doing is aimed at supporting USSD and QR codes, both static and dynamic, but it could be any front-end, in fact, because actually the bulk of the work, the infrastructure below that, is independent of that front-end tech. Principles, well, after 30 years working in merchant payments, I can tell you that merchant payments are not straightforward. So we decided to start at the simple end and build out from there, using the following principles. Build on Moduloop P2B instant payments. We expose merchant payment details but anonymize them using merchant IDs. Require merchant registration so that we can support merchant IDs and identify and control fraudulent activity. And develop an approach that supports multiple customer payment initiation methods as chosen by each customer. On merchant registration, it is definitely on our roadmap after this to allow small merchants, micro merchants, to accept payments and using QR codes without registration. But that needs some more of the monitoring technology put in place before we can actually do that. So taking an attitude of don't try and run before you can walk, we're going to require registration and merchant IDs to begin with. These are the elements that we'd have to build for a dynamic QR payment, which it requires a connected and live QR code processor, which is connected to every transaction. It requires a QR code generator, which can generate one for every transaction, and it requires a merchant registry. So we took the view that we're not going to do dynamic QR because we can do without the QR code processor and the QR code generator and just use static QR codes. And in fact, the merchant registry is an essential part of a live service, but for a proof of concept, we can simply limit it to a much more straightforward, simple extension to the existing oracles. So this is the merchant payments ecosystem we ultimately envisage. So there's a modular loop hub at the bottom, of course. There's a merchant registry module which sits on top of it. There's the payments extension module, uses both the merchant registry and the modular loop hub. And on top of that, enabled by all of this, is the customer front end. And the fraud and money laundering module is at the side. It monitors and can also, in principle, disable a particular merchant if they're found to be operating fraudulently or operating a money laundering scheme of some sort. So that's where we want to get to, but we're not there yet. For the merchant registry, we looked at the existing modular loop ALS Oracle as a candidate for implementation, and it looks good, but it will need some extensions, essentially clip-on bits on the side, which don't actually get involved in any of the modular loop transactions, but provide us a link back into some of the merchant data. And part of what we're trying to do now is to firm up on those additional data requirements. It has to look in 3 directions. So it supports transaction routing, as every Oracle does now. But separately, it provides a validation against for every transaction against AML and fraud assessment. So the AML fraud engine off the side can essentially flick a flag within the Oracle to say, no, this merchant is involved in money laundering, disable it, and work with an external fraud engine to evaluate merchant status dynamically as well. On the customer front end, we can support multiple front end. We've been looking at customer initiated, merchant request to pay, and 3PPI are on the roadmap, but later. It's currently validated against USSD and static QR. We've done the design work for dynamic QR. And we want to engage with in-country retail payments, focusing again, as I've said multiple times, on push payments, not pull. So the lessons for a successful payment solution is, well, the very first one is separate rails from services. The modular loop hub provides an extremely efficient, cost-effective, interoperable set of payments rails. If you're going to, and then it's good practice to build on that as a separate service, the actual merchant payment service or the scheme, which happens to use the modular loop hub as its payment rails. And that means you can actually deploy multiple payment schemes on the same rails. And it can also coexist against other payment schemes. It provides interoperability at the business level as well as technical. You have to make it free to customers and usually free to merchants as well, so that you have to find other ways of making it cost effective, not by charging people, because people won't use it. And of course, make sure customers can use it. It's a testament to people's technical ability and adaptability that anyone can use USSD reliably. But we are also keen that we should use QR because point and pay has got to be easier. So this was our approach to developing a backlog. We had multiple workshop sessions where we looked at the key players. We identified 4 or 5 of them, and for each we developed. We looked at the use cases and looked at the functions that each would have to perform, and how they would each interoperate. So that includes merchants, customers, DFSPs, a payment scheme operator. I think we also had a merchant registry operator. We looked at the various use cases and defined the stakeholder objectives for each of those use cases. And we looked at the infrastructure, the services, and the processes that each would have to go through. These are the various use cases we came up with. Looking at customers who want to buy goods and services, scan a QR code, complain about a merchant, look up merchant information. In fact, that's during a transaction. A DFSP might have to issue QR codes because we're assuming that a hub itself is not going to, or a scheme itself it's not cost effective for them to do it for small merchants. So we assume that DFSPs can issue QR codes to their merchants after registering a merchant. There's a whole load of use cases for merchants as well. And there's a whole load of use cases for, what's that one? Scheme operators. Yep. These are the various features that we feel have to be available for merchant payments. API accessible microservices, an online portal for user interaction. Role-based access control is absolutely vital if we're going to get the security right. Why compromise the security of a closed loop hub by giving an insecure merchant payment service over the top? We envisage multiple mechanisms for QR code delivery. It can be via a payment scheme, it can be via the DFSPs. Extensible data and interface, a centralized merchant registration and ID issuing, though DFSPs can act on behalf of a merchant, and securely signed QR codes. We take the view that there's no real case for encrypting the data that's held in QR codes. However, you want to make sure that the QR code you're scanning actually relates to this payment scheme. So we require that QR codes are signed using a scheme-specific key or a derived key by a DFSP. And then that data used to generate the QR code. Okay, so that's all about the background work that we've been doing. There's now a short demo which Lewis is going to give, which is a simple proof of concept demo, which is customer, scan QR code, enter price, push the payment through a closed loop hub to pay the merchant. And once the merchant knows they have the money, release the goods. This is a pre-generated static QR code that encodes a merchant ID. We're not using a merchant registry, just the existing Oracle, which itself is an important statement. So at this point, I will hand over to Lewis, who I'm trusting is standing by, ready to do the demo. Thank you, Lewis.
Indeed, he is. Thank you, Paul. I'll just get this switched up. Oh, there we go. It worked. Very cool. I'm kind of surprised. Thank you, Paul's embodied torso. I think he's online, so we'll be able to promote him and if we have time for questions afterwards. Hi, everyone. This is my second demo today. I gave a demo from 2 years ago earlier. You might have recognized that guy. So thank you, Paul. A little bit of background. I've been threatening to do a demo for the last year or so, and I haven't ever really managed to execute, but I was lucky enough to rope in an intern from my town to help me out. He's studying at the Flinders University in Adelaide at the moment. And so him and I worked on this together, and to kind of expand on some of Paul's points, just to set up the demo environment that I'm going to be sharing with you right now. We developed a very simple QR code scheme. This is not one that you would ever want to take into production, but it's one that works for the demo, where we have the party ID type, a party identifier, and then the sub ID, the optional sub ID, which is based on the closed loop API. So the idea being that you can encode a business's identification number with a party ID type of business, and then an identifier, which here is just an example, could be a phone number, or it could be a number issued to it by the merchant registry that Paul was talking about. So here is what that looks like. We take this JSON formatted string, we strip out the white space, and we encode it into a QR code. And that's what I also have on my phone here that we'll be scanning shortly for the demo. And then just to give you an idea of what the actual environment looks like, I have on my computer, I have demo Mojo Wallet, which was something developed by our friends at Coil that I decided we should kind of extend instead of making a new demo from scratch. Demo Mojo Wallet then loads a web app. Now, in the real world, this would be probably someone's mobile app on their mobile device, or it could, as Paul was saying, be a USSD based flow as well. Demo Mojo Wallet connects to the Mojo Loop sandbox, which then has on the receiving side, the merchant receiving side, you can see that, the JBank simulator, which is just an imaginary bank. So on the left-hand side is me, the customer, who wants to buy some goods. And on the right-hand side is the merchant who's going to present the QR code to the customer. All right. Now let's switch to the other screen and hope it works. So, as I said earlier, this might look familiar to some people. This is the demo Mojo wallet that the Coil guys worked on. And we have an example demo account here. XML is I think it's a fake currency that we made up. It's like X Mojo, maybe it's Mojo bucks or something. So here you can imagine this is the interface of a customer who wants to buy something from a merchant. And here is the merchant and their QR code, which is just a simple little QR code here that I have a picture of. So we can go to the QR checkout page and it says, scan the QR code to continue. So we can scan the QR and then this looked up the business identifier 002001239, just a random number I chose. But this would be, for example, this number would be registered with the merchant oracle across a scheme. We can then confirm, and this is going to do the party lookup. So behind the scene, we went to the sandbox. We said, hey, Mr. Sandbox, get parties, business, and that number. And we returned the name of the business was Mr. Pandasal. And we're going to send him 1,000 XMLs. And this is the quote lookup phase where we looked up the price that it would cost to send that transfer or the fees that are involved. And he received 900 XML and then confirm the transfer and then success. So that's a very basic merchant flow using a static QR code. As Paul said earlier, you could imagine this also working over USSD if you had as we've probably all seen, the QR code and then the 6 or 7 digit number for the merchant identifier as well down the bottom that someone could plug in to a USSD. Okay, that's all I had, and I'll open the floor up for questions as long as we've got time, Simeon. 2 short questions. John Mark, I'm nervous to ask you. He was first though. Fair enough.
Thank you for the presentation and the demo. Just a bit of context. Within some of the markets that at least I am aware of, we have merchant payments. But these merchant payments are closed loop. Yeah. So on the MTN network, we do like the QR that you've demonstrated, we actually do it. And even other networks are doing something similar. And like you've said, on the USSD, you enter the merchant ID and the rest flows. Now, I would want us to challenge ourselves on the next level, whereby merchant interoperability is now a need within the markets. So I'm looking within our setup here, what can we quickly be able to make use of and say, go to a market and maybe give a proposition that we can achieve merchant interoperability with Mojo Loop, not necessarily maybe all the components, but model it in such a way that if a market has 3, 4, 5 players, we bring in this component and then it can be able to enable the interoperability, merchant interoperability. And of course, the rest, the user experience can always be defined to us and all of that. So the question would be, have you looked at the components that can be quickly used just for merchant interoperability? Thank you.
So I'll let Paul chime in as well. The biggest thing is the need for a scheme that governs the issuance of merchant IDs in a market. And that will have its own rules associated with it. Questions like how do you How do you issue those merchant IDs? How do you cover things like till numbers as well, if you wanted to have like a sub ID? And then I think that, as Paul was kind of saying, links in with the existing merchant oracles to be able to do the lookup to find, whichever FSP they need to send to. Paul, is there more you could add to that?
Well, the interoperability clearly comes through the merchant loop hubs, that it doesn't matter which wallets the customer is using, which wallet the merchant's using, or if it's a bank or whatever, that provided they're connected to a hub, you get that interoperability immediately. Doing a merchant payment scheme via QR codes or USSD is really straightforward from a technical perspective if you're not concerned about fraud or money laundering. So you have to be really careful around this, because we all know that if you put something in that's unprotected, people will find a way to exploit it extremely quickly. I looked at an interoperable payment scheme, or merchant payment scheme, it was in the Middle East, in fact, where we were having serious problems with people setting up fake merchants and using them for laundering money through what was a regulated payment scheme. And I don't see why you would expect anything else. So we need to put countermeasures in from the bottom up. So there are multiple aspects to that. You need to have merchant registration. You need to say that this is a merchant that is real. It has been registered with the authorities, and you know where they live, to speak in basic terms. But that's not to say that has to apply to all merchants, because we're very well aware that there's probably the most numerous merchants in most countries are the very small micro merchants. And we would take the view that they don't particularly need to be registered until they reach a certain volume of transactions or value of transactions. So right down at the level 1, and I should explain, I'm thinking in terms of 4 levels of merchants. Well, level 4 is the multinationals, and level 1 is that stall beside the road. They don't need to be registered. They can get a merchant ID without providing all the documentation that's necessary. But we do monitor their use, and if they suddenly start to receive huge payments, like 20 different payments, all of the same amount, all within an hour, all going to this one roadside merchant, then I think we would immediately want to say, oh, no, there's something wrong there, and provide some form of protection to the infrastructure, the ecosystem, in order to control that. There's a whole lot of work. A lot of our focus has been on how do we actually stop becoming a vehicle for fraud and money laundering. I see that Justus is online as well, but Justus, do you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Paul. So as you said, I mean, we definitely want to be able to do this within a controlled environment. You need to know who the merchants are that you're going to be dealing with. Having that located in some sort of centralized authority, I think, is extremely important. And from there are a number of ways that you can achieve that. I know that there is a move across throughout Africa to start centralizing some of that information into a regulated space. And then some countries already have centralized, not necessarily for merchants, but at least for company registries. And then as a merchant being a fully vetted entity would then be a little bit more secure in the platform. And I think that's going to be essential as a component of being able to link merchants into a payment scheme.
Cool. Thank you very much. Is that it? Or we got time for one more? Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one, can the merchant use a printed QR?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, a paper-based QR.
Yeah.
All right. So the second one is who shall normally perform the merchant registration? Is it the hub operator or the merchant FSP? Thank you.
In my view, asking the hub operator to do it is unrealistic. I think that we should be asking the DFSP that holds the account to do that registration. We have done some looking into how we control that and how we counter fraudulent operation by an FSP, which astonishingly does happen. And also I don't think we mentioned in detail, I can't remember if I mentioned it during the presentation, but the QR code that's issued has to be signed, cryptographically signed, so that you know it has been issued by the scheme. So we have a mechanism of creating what are known as derived keys, which are issued to an FSP that they can use to sign QR codes that they issue. So that protects against QR codes which are not actually issued by the scheme. So the app that an FSP might issue for their customers to use can actually check that this is a legitimate QR code, for example. Fraudulent operation by an FSP itself, you have to have simple processes around vetting the issuance of QR codes, which I'm afraid is a manual process. You can't actually remotely check that somebody at an FSP is behaving fraudulently. Does that answer your question?
Yep, cool. Thank you very much, Paul and Justus, and I'll hand back to Simeon.
Thanks, guys. A round of applause for them. I do encourage you all to stand up for just a minute and just get a stretch. I've been sitting more than 80 minutes while I tee up the next video. Welcome, Richard. Okay. Excellent. We shall go straight to the next. All right, Paul Makin is staying with us, but he sent along a pre-record for bulk payments. So we'll have the bulk payment session now, and then I'll allow one short question after. So here we go.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Makin. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to be in Arusha this week. I'd have loved to have met some of you. But unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, I simply cannot travel at the moment. I currently have two complementary roles. I'm for the Moduloop Foundation, I'm leading the product council. For Modusbox, I'm the product manager for the WinePay deployment in Myanmar. I want to talk to you today about bulk payments. And a lot of the work that we've done over the last 3 months and will be doing over the next PI has been shaped by the real world experience of the WinePay deployment, because we want to use bulk payments for loan disbursements and later on electronic cash transfers for WinePay. So I think the real world experience has been very valuable in shaping the development of bulk. Many of you will have heard me speak before about the problems with the current Moduloop bulk payment service. In itself, as a bulk payment service, taking a bulk list from payer, DFSP to payee, DFSP, it works extremely well and reliably. However, that doesn't quite match market expectations. A payer, DFSP, a bank in particular that wants to do a bulk payment, expects to just compile a list of payers, their account details and amount to be paid, without worrying where the payee has their accounts. So it can be at multiple DFSPs. And Moduloop, by contrast, wants a series of sorted lists, one per payee DFSP. And that mismatch of expectations has held us back somewhat. And secondly, payee DFSPs vary quite significantly in their capabilities, as we've learned from Myanmar and elsewhere. Some can accept a bulk payments list, others can't and expect just individual transactions. So how do we both address that mismatch in market expectations and also deal with the limited capabilities of some DFSPs? Well, we have a short-term solution. And this will allow us to get up and running nice and quickly with bulk payments. We accept a bulk payments list from a DFSP and deal with it as though it's a series of individual transactions. So we break up the list and process them one by one. We go through the Moduloop process of discovery, agreement, quotation, transfer, and assemble a single bulk transfer response and return it to the sender. Notice that we don't fail the whole bulk payment if a single transaction fails. We just return the status of all the individual responses. The pros of this response, well, it's simple, it's straightforward to implement, and it supports some DFSP's inability to accept bulk lists because we're just doing individual transactions. It does, however, have some disadvantages. It'll place increased load on the hub. I mean, that's obvious when you think about it. When you're taking a bulk payments list and taking it from A and delivering it to B, that's a single step, if you like, speaking at a high level. Whereas when we break it down into its individual components, then obviously there's significantly more processing. And as a consequence of that, this approach is only going to be suitable for relatively short lists. So it works for loan disbursements where an MFI may want to do 10, 20, 50 disbursements, but it's not going to work for G2P payments or ECT, where a government might want to do a salary run of thousands of tens of thousands of transactions, for example, or to do a COVID payment of similar volumes. Doing those as individual transactions would pose an intolerable strain on the hub. So as I say, we need to limit the list size for this short-term solution, and we think that'll be about 1,000 transactions, which will be a manageable ceiling. Of course, that's not good enough for WinePay and elsewhere when we want to move to full-blown electronic cash transfers. So we have a medium-term solution, which is to accept a bulk payments list from a DFSP and to treat it as a series of individual lists for destination DFSPs. So we take the list, we break it open, if you like, and we sort it through by destination DFSP and create a series of individual lists. And then we process each list as a Moduloop bulk payment. And then at the end, we assemble a single bulk transfer response and return it to the sender. So it's completely transparent to the sender DFSP, and it just looks like a standard bulk payment. Of course, for some payee DFSPs, it will be necessary to break up the list at the receive end and process it as individual transactions because of the limitations I already mentioned. The pros, well, this will allow us to reach scale. We'll be able to deal with those lists of thousands of tens of thousands of disbursements and not put too much of a strain on the Moduloop hub. And it will also support some DFSP's inability to accept bulk lists. Cons, well, it's more complex to implement and it does have a longer lead time. So consequently, we're going to focus on the short-term solution now. And once that's up and running, move to migrate to the medium-term solution. The route to implementation of the short-term solution is relatively straightforward. Because, as I've mentioned already, this is a core use case for WinePay, the short-term solution has been fast-tracked by the development team. WinePay uses Payment Manager to connect all of the various participating DFSPs into the hub. And that gives us a route to implementation for bulk. We're going to use Payment Manager to orchestrate the bulk payments. Now, as many of you will know, Payment Manager is a very flexible open source tool, which allows us to connect the core banking systems of DFSPs into a merge loop hub with a minimum of fuss. So we use a core connector to connect into the DFSP, and there's a great deal of flexibility there in customization for different core banking systems. And we use the merge loop connector to manage the connection into merge loop. And so there's a lot of other stuff within Payment Manager as well. There's the dashboards, there's the ability to view the connections and to essentially make sure that individual transactions are proceeding as expected, and to look into error conditions, etc. All of which are bundled into the single other stuff box at the bottom, because it doesn't concern us here. So, as you will have gathered, there's a core connector element of Payment Manager, which is specific to WinePay. And there we're going to handle the stuff which is about routing of bulk payments according to the aliases that the WinePay deployment supports. And then there's the merge loop connector side of bulk payments, which is all about the open source. And this development of the short-term solution will form part of the OSS implementation. Just to highlight something about the routing of payments, Myanmar, as is the case in many other countries, has multiple mobile wallets which are supported on a single device. So I can have a smartphone with 2, 3, 4 mobile wallets on which I may use for different purposes. And consequently, routing a payment to an MSISDN mobile number is not sufficient. I also need to know which wallet it's being sent to. So we're using a routing method of wallet shortcode, comma, MSISDN. So 0103, for example, then mobile number. And this isn't new to WinePay. WinePay uses a similar routing model for loan disbursements for MFIs. Loan repayments to MFIs, where it's MFI shortcode and loan account number. So we're able to repurpose the loan repayment oracle for bulk payments and therefore loan disbursements. This is the process flow that we've worked through, and I'm going to zoom in because it's totally unreadable to both you and to me. The important point down here is this grey blob down the middle, which is Payment Manager. And just to break that out a little, you can see it's broken out, as we've mentioned, into the two halves, Core Connector and Merge Loop Connector. So moving to the Core Connector first, zooming in on that part, we take a loan disbursement, a bulk payment request as a single message into Core Connector. We then have to do in Core Connector a validation piece where we are validating the MSISDN that we receive, because many of the MFIs, and we would imagine also NGOs and government departments, etc., are going to give us malformed MSISDNs. So the Core Connector's role here is to essentially state whether an individual MSISDN is malformed, and if it is, then we fail that individual transaction within the list. We also actually impose a timeout and a maximum total fee amount for the bulk transfer, but that's been blurred somewhat in the detail here. Moving on to the Merge Loop Connector side, this is a little more complex, as you can see. So down here we have this line here is for the Merge Loop Hub, and this here is the Oracle. So we loop through each transfer in the bulk message we've received. So we create a transaction ID for it, a Mojo Loop transaction ID. We do a get parties, which looks up the DFSP for this alias and ID. As I mentioned before, this is wallet identifier and MSISDN. We look up the corresponding party, identify the wallet for this requested transfer. We return the wallet ID and return that back to the Mojo Loop connector. We then do a post quotes, and we get a quote request from the payee DFSP and return it back to the Mojo Loop connector. We update the transaction status for that individual transaction and attach the quote response, and we add the fees in to the total fees for the entire bulk transfer. We then do a post transfers for that individual transfer. And we perform the liquidity check, reserve the funds, post the transfers to the wallet, commit the funds, and return it to the Mojo Loop connector. We then update the transaction status, attach the quote response. All of this stuff down here with the Mojo Loop connector and the Oracle is business as usual. No changes are required. Omitted from here, but not in the deeper design document, is the processing of maximum fee amounts for the entire quote, for the entire bulk transfer, and the timeout for the entire list. So progress. We have a design. You've just seen the high level version. There's obviously lower level design documentation. It's been reviewed by the development teams, and all of the user stories have been developed and documented. All of these stories have been sized, acceptance criteria defined, tests defined, etc., including automated tests, which has become standard process now. The implementation has begun, and it will be completed this PI. I expect us to be live with bulk payments in Myanmar within this PI, and that will also support directly loan disbursements. For those, I should mention that some MFIs can already disperse loans. It's just not via the bulk payments mechanism. We have an unanticipated bonus. During the design process, we discovered that, well, first of all, we needed to modify the Oracle to support the aliases for wallets, and therefore MSISDN routing to multiple wallets using the same mobile phone number. And it became clear that the most straightforward route to implementation included, as a byproduct, the upgrade of the Oracle to support P2P transactions. So buy one bulk disbursement, get P2P for free, which is good news for all of us and for WinePay in particular. Of course, we're not planning to actually go live with P2P yet, but the good news is it's there and ready for when we want it. So that's it for our update on bulk payments. I hope you'll agree that good progress has been made. I don't know quite how this mechanism will work, but I'm hoping that after this video has been shown, there will be a channel for questions, and I'll certainly be around for the next few minutes or whatever period is allowed for those questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. I will allow just one question, just so we're able to catch up with time. Any question? All right. There you go.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to know if you can't also include all or none basis while handling the batches, because most of these banks transactions or bank transfers, normally when a batch has an issue, So they return all the entire batch rather than processing few records inside the batch. So I don't know whether you have considered that case, because let's say if it's a corporate customer and he has an approval, let's say for $1,000 for that specific batch, and you only process transactions for $900. So in terms of business or approvals, it may create an issue. So did you think about this all or none basis? Thank you.
We did consider it. We spoke to a number of people and were told that the view was that this all or none or failing an entire batch is a limitation of existing services, and that it was an undesirable feature because it could end up, if you've got a large number of payments, 1,000 or more payments, failing it because of one malformed address was not sensible. You should allow the other 999 to go through. I can see from what you're saying, there could be a business case, and maybe it could be, since we're at an early stage of the design process, the development process, it is certainly worth considering adding that extra flag in, an all or none flag. I agree.
Can I add to that, Paul?
Yeah.
We did look at this, as Paul rightly points out, and we've looked at it a number of times. And for bulk payments, the general consensus is that it should be we make whichever payments we can make, and we don't make the others. And that should be considerably eased by the fact that we are doing a quote phase in advance. So we should be clear that all of the payments can in fact be made by the time we submit the batch. However, as Paul says, we've considered adding a flag to the interface to enable DFSPs to specify that they want the batch to be failed if any of it fails. And that would enable us to do all or none composite payments, which is something that we've been asked about in the past.
Thank you, Michael. Yes.
Excellent. That roundly brings us to time. A round of applause for Paul and team. Excellent. Thank you very much.